Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. As the saying goes, love is a verb, and healthy relationships requires intention, attention, time, and care. However, from our Clearhead data, we can see that out of all the people who said they were struggling with mental health challenges due to personal reasons, general relationship struggles, family difficulties, and partner difficulties were the top 3 issues people were dealing with. To help us grasp a greater understanding of what a fulfilling relationship should look like, how we can find them, and more importantly, how to maintain them, our expert guest today is Serafin Upton. Serafin has worked in New Zealand and Australia as a family, couples, and sex therapist for over 20 years. On top of her extensive experience and qualification, she has also trained under world-renowned sex and relationship therapists Esther Perel and Perel. Welcome, Serafin.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. Well, let's start off with, how did you even get onto this path, Serafin? It's a very interesting path that you've chosen.
That's a good question. I think probably to annoy my parents because they wanted me to become like a doctor or a lawyer, and so I think becoming a sex therapist kind of ruffled their feathers a little bit. So I think I probably did it slightly to unsettle them. But they've grown used to me over time. But I've always been interested in human sexuality. And when I was at university, I did gender studies, but that wasn't quite enough for me. I wanted more. I wanted to learn more about the sociology of sex. And so, yeah, it's something that I've always been really fascinated by. I started off working as a child and family therapist in child and family therapy work. I've done a lot of youth work, and I really loved that. But I did that for a very long time, and then one day decided that I wanted to do something completely different, and so I retrained as a couples therapist.
Wow, you've truly learned how to understand people of all stages of life and how they interact with each other. What was the commonality that you learned, being a child's therapist, a family therapist, a couples therapist, a sex therapist? Were there any commonality amongst all of those different specializations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably it's best answered by thinking about like the types of people I've worked with. And what I've realized is it doesn't matter who somebody is, like whether they have nothing or they have like everything. Everyone's fears are still the same. It doesn't matter how much money you have or what background you come from. You still are worried, like, will my partner love me? Is my partner going to stay? What did I do wrong? And so I think what I've noticed about this work from hearing so many stories over the years is that we all of us have the same fears. There is, like, I hear the same thing over and over again. No matter how diverse the stories are, the fear around love and loss are always the same.
Yeah, and that's what you sort of shared with me earlier, which is that the same skills that you teach someone as a couples therapist can also be applied in the context of, for example, parenting. Can you share with us some of the common skills that you have taught people that you've really seen makes a difference in their relationships?
Yeah, so great question. the skills that we need to operate a romantic relationship are not so dissimilar to the skills we need to raise a child. And they're around things like attunement and responsiveness. And so I've had great success in being able to show people that their partner is actually not being that much of a pain. Their partner really wants to be in like a rhythm with their partner. They want for there to be synchronicity within a particular moment. And when a moment between two people is ruptured, you lose that synchronicity. And so, like, teaching people about rhythm and about attunement and relationships is has massive success. And it's that attunement is what we want to see replicated in effectively all intimate relationships that matter to us.
That sounds good. What's like a very practical thing that you could share in that context? Like what's one thing I can do to create more attunement with someone that I care about?
Yeah. Okay. So, it doesn't really matter who you're with. Like, maybe you're a doctor with your patient, or maybe you're a parent with your child, or maybe you're a teacher with a student. If somebody is expressing themselves to you, the most powerful thing you can do in that moment is to join with their experience. So, like, if a child is like, look, I did this, I finished this math equation that I hadn't been able to get my head around. Like, I got it. And the parent or the teacher then reflects back to the child the magic that child feels in that experience, which it looks like, oh, wow, like that you mastered that. Like, go you. Like, I know that you worked really hard for that. And it's no different to if our partner comes to us and they're like complaining about something that we go, that must have been so frustrating, right? And immediately when the child hears the teacher say, or the parent say, it must feel so good to have mastered that, or when our partner says to us, that must have been so frustrating, immediately, like, we feel that attunement, we feel that rhythm and that synchronicity, which is like, you're here with me in my experience. And if you can do that, you can do no wrong.
So that's a really powerful way to kind of go. And it's not super hard either, right? It's just being in the moment with this person and trying to just reflect what you've just heard back.
Yeah. But it is hard if you're in a romantic relationship and your partner's mad with you. It's hard.
How do you deal with that then? How do you deal with the fact that, I don't think any of us would say we don't want to be present and caring of the people we love. But as you said, life happens. I might just be super distracted because something is going on for me personally, or for me at work, or that maybe I'm having a bad day myself. So I don't really have the capacity to be supportive to another person who is having a bad day. How do we deal with the fact that we're not always perfect human beings?
Yeah, great question. So what I coach people to do is to be honest about their capacity. So, for example, I might, I'll talk about a couple that I work with where one person would be working at home and the other partner would come in and they'd be like talking about their day and they're like super excited because they haven't seen their partner and they're like, I want to tell you about my day. And the other person's like consumed by and focused on their task at hand. And so what I get the person who's focused to do is to be like, wow, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for telling me. Can I please finish this? And in half an hour, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to listen to you, share your day. I really want to hear about your day. And so that works really well because then both people get what they need. One person feels like they're important, and the other person gets to refocus on what's the priority for them in that moment. And so it's just about communicating your capacity. So like Brené Brown, who I'm sure you're completely across, she mentions that her and her husband, when they come home, they say to each other, like, what, like in statistical terms, what their capacity is. So like one of them might be like, I'm at like a 20 right now. And the other person's like, I'm at like a 40 right now. And so that they're both kind of being transparent about their capacity and their ability to be able to be present in that environment or in that moment.
What you're saying is that if someone is trying to connect with you and you can't actually connect at the level that you want to be, you should be honest with this person and say, hey, this is what's going on for me right now. Can we talk about this in half an hour once I reply this email and it's out of my mind? So being able to try and find a way to connect where you both are in the space to connect is what I'm hearing from you. Is that right?
Absolutely, because when you reflect back your partner or your friend or your child's need for them to connect, and you reflecting that back and saying, I know you want to talk to me and I really want to talk to you, like that's 90% of it done. That is the relationship right there, because you've said in your communication about your own capacity, you've said, this relationship matters to me. You matter to me so much that I'm going to be honest about my capacity, and I'm also going to follow you up. Now, the following up part is the most important part. So we always get the person who initiated a conversation or initiated a moment to not be the one who then has to chase. We want the person who couldn't respond or the person who didn't have capacity to then do the chasing. Hey, I know you wanted to talk to me earlier, and oh my goodness, I was so busy, but I'm all yours now. Can you please share what you wanted to share earlier? Like, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you.
That's awesome. You talked about it in the context of capacity, which fluctuates for us all daily and in the moment. What about attachment styles? Does that ever come into play, and how often do we have to bring that into the picture intentionally?
That's a really good question. I think I'll answer it by saying this. You can have somebody who's got a secure attachment. If their partner or their friend or somebody who matters a lot to them, if that person starts behaving in a way that's kind of avoidant, then you can take someone who has a secure attachment and all of a sudden they start to develop an anxious attachment. So attachment styles are very malleable, right? So it's not fixed. And what I love most about my work, the thing that the reason I keep doing this is because you can create secure attachment within a dyad, within a two-person system. You can make two people who might be anxious or avoidant. It's very rare that you get both. You usually get an anxious and avoidant, but you can change and shape that dynamic to be a more secure attachment. So that's why I do this work, is because it doesn't matter what attachment style you have, you can make your relationship a very secure attachment style.
Well, I didn't realize that your attachment style will actually change depending on who you're interacting with. But it's great to hear that regardless, you can get it to a point of stable attachment. Would you be able to share with us some practical tips that you've advised your clients on how to develop secure attachment styles?
Okay, so for example, if I'm working with somebody who's quite avoidant, who really struggle, and avoidant just means, all it means is, you know what, when I was growing up, I couldn't depend on my caregivers to meet my attunement needs. And so in order to compensate for that, I learned that I could depend on myself. And so somebody who's avoidant, all that means is I'm scared of being close because I got let down when I was a kid. So now I feel like the best person to take care of me is me. And so a lot of my work with folks who are like that, who are fearful of that emotional intimacy, is to slowly build up a tolerance for closeness that they are in control of, so that they stay in that dyad, stay in that system without pulling away or breaking up the relationship. Because when you've got somebody who's quite avoidant, the closer two people get, the more that person who's avoidant freaks out, because intimacy feels very terrifying for them because of their previous experiences. So it's kind of like if you have somebody who's like has a phobia of spiders, what I say is you wouldn't just like put the tarantula in their face. You would have like a cartoon picture of the tarantula on the wall, like 5 meters away from them. Be like, there's a little anime character of a spider, right? And it's just, and then next week, maybe the anime spider moves a little bit closer to the person. So we're just building up that person's tolerance for intimacy rather than flooding them, which is very destabilizing.
That's interesting. What would you suggest for someone who's the opposite, which is the anxious attachment?
For somebody who's anxious, it's about, assuming that I'm seeing them individually, it's about educating them on educating their avoidant partner about how their avoidant partner can lean in a little so that that anxious attachment style is not getting triggered by the avoidant behavior, right? For example, you know, I mentioned earlier where you say like, I'm busy right now, but let me come back to you. That line, let me come back to you, I promise this is important, I will come back to you. That is like, this is the music that soothes somebody who's anxious. It soothes their soul, and they will leave you alone. You can do whatever you want because you've promised them that you are going to come back. And that's the key to helping people who are feeling anxious, is you promise that you'll come back. That's all they need to hear, is you're going to come back.
And the most important thing is you do come back. Don't promise and then don't come back, because then that's terrible. You've taught the person to not trust you.
Angela, I'm so glad that you said that because I forgot that part. Yes, you're right. And that's critical that they come back. Yeah. Yeah.
So what are other unhelpful patterns that couples who are in sort of stable long-term relationship fall trapped to that, you know, you want to share with us to be mindful of, and then maybe what we can do about it?
I'll talk about I put this into AI the other day and I asked AI to graph it for me because I'm a total nerd. But one of the things that I find so fascinating about couples who have been together for a long time is you get this really bizarre intimacy trajectory whereby like the longer they've been together, on the one hand, their kind of platonic intimacy of companionship and sharing stuff goes up. So like they get closer, right? But they also become more distant when it comes to non-emotional intimacy, or like anything like erotic or romantic tends to go by the wayside, even though they're fairly close. Right? So I was like, what is this about? And what I realized, obviously, through working with or like learning from Esther Perel and others, is that we actually start to fear our partner the more time goes by. And the reason is, if you just have a casual encounter, that's like, you know, a few dollars into your bank account. And if the person's like, you know what, this was just a fun thing, I don't want to hang out with you anymore, you're like, ouch, that hurts. But, you know, I only spent like a couple of bucks on dinner. If you've been with somebody for a long time, the stakes are higher. You have invested more. This is like a savings account. You want to protect it with your life. And so what happens is you are actually less likely to share because you are so scared of the potential rejection or judgment, or maybe they'll think you're weird, or maybe they'll pull away from you, right? And so you actually distance yourself a little bit to prevent that possible rejection because you've invested so much. And this happens subtly and subconsciously over time. So couples become more and more distant. And so you get this really weird inverse like intimacy trajectory, right? Because we ultimately, all of us really, deeply fear vulnerability. Like we really want intimacy, but we fear vulnerability, including myself. Like just because I'm a relationship therapist doesn't mean I like vulnerability. I'm like, I really freaking don't like it. And so because we all struggle with vulnerability, then intimacy becomes tricky because in order to have intimacy, you need vulnerability first.
Sorry, Serafin, and I might have misunderstood you. So you're saying that as a couple stay together for longer, they have increased intimacy in the context of emotional closeness. So I will share with you, I guess, my problems at work. But you're saying the distance, is it physical intimacy? Is that what you mean? Or I'm trying to understand what gets closer and what gets more distant.
Yeah, closer as in like we hang out all the time, we talk about work, there's banter, we get on well as parents, we work well in terms of planning family holidays. So it's kind of a
I got you.
Yeah.
But you're not sharing the deep and meaningful stuff like I don't know. I feel insecure about sharing with you this this new thing I want to explore about myself.
Yeah. There's this and also but also giving. Like it's not just like people don't just get anxious about like sharing parts of ourselves. We also start to get anxious about sharing. Like we might get anxious about being affectionate towards somebody we've been with for a long time. We might get anxious or like kind of weirded out by giving somebody that we've been with a long time, giving them compliments. Right? So there's this kind of drawing in of not giving anything out.
It sounds so counterintuitive and counterproductive as well. So what do you advise couples to do when they've reached that stage where it's really noticeable they're just two ships sailing parallel in the night?
Good question. I think there's lots of things that I say and do with a couple like that, but one of the main things I do is I get them to carve out space, because the longer people have been together, space disappears. So the relationship real estate becomes more and more scarce over time. Like they'll fill it with like jobs that they have to do around the house, taking kids here, there, and everywhere, working longer hours at work, right? So when we actually like look at their relationship landscape, there's actually not much space and time to even connect. And so that's probably the first hurdle, is because they've effectively it's bizarre, but people kind of remove the romantic relationship from even existing. Like their life becomes about tasks and errands and things that need to get done, or it becomes about their career, or it becomes about the kids. And when you look at it, like I literally will sit down with people and be like, well, how many hours do you actually have left over to spend with your partner? And sometimes there's like literally minutes in the week, that's it. So how can we develop intimacy if there's no space?
And so you're not saying space in the context of like giving each other space. You're saying space in terms of the context of spending time together in a romantic way. So are you an advocate for, making sure you schedule date nights, or is that, or does it have to be spontaneous? Yeah. What are your recommendations?
Yeah. So this is what I recommend. I don't recommend date nights, but I prescribe fun and adventure. Because what we know from the research is the couples who have the best relationships have the most fun. So I don't want you to go out for dinner and watch a movie. I don't want you to do something boring. I want you to do something that's kind of going to, get your dopamine up, or make you even feel a little bit anxious or even frightened's good. Okay? Because what happens is when we feel those big feelings, we then associate those big feelings with our partner, and then we start to find our partner even more attractive. So when I say to people, if you're going to go on a date, I say it's better to go on a date once a month and make it kind of scary or like kind of crazy and super fun than go out for dinner once a week and like look at each other over the table and talk about the kids or work.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
The other part of it is I don't recommend dates, but I do recommend what I call liminal space, which is space that it's like you haven't done anything with it. It's just space that's created that's always there. So that if something is going to happen, it can happen. Because most people don't like the pressure of a date night or the pressure of like scheduled sex, because then they get anticipatory anxiety and there's like pressure that you can't get out. It's like you have to go on the date or you have to have sex, and not many people like that. So what I say is create a space where anything could happen, and if it doesn't happen, that's okay, because you know that you've got liminal space coming up in 3 more nights from now, for example.
That makes sense. I guess that's a good way to transition to single people. And, you talked about the context of connecting with people that you are already a partner, that's your partner. But what about the people out there who are single and they're wanting to connect, and modern dating and online dating just makes it really difficult to do that? What are your tips for connecting with strangers, I guess, that you want to build a meaningful relationship with?
Oh, that's a massive question. I think probably in New Zealand, the best thing for now is repeated exposure. So what I mean by that is that to forge a meaningful connection with somebody, it's best if you can see them as often as possible, right? So that the stakes are low. So, for example, if you like join a walking group or a rock climbing group, and then you see that person every Wednesday, and so you get to build a connection with them over time, that's like, it's low risk with potentially high rewards.
That sounds good. And, you mentioned that, for example, regardless of who we are, we don't like to not have our needs met. We don't like to be rejected when we're being vulnerable. One of the things that comes with modern dating is stuff like people ghosting you, where you thought you've built a really great connection and then the next thing you know, they've disappeared. Like, how do you deal with the rejection part of dating?
I think being rejected in an online environment is so different to being rejected in a community context. What I mean by that is the chances of us getting ghosted if we got introduced to that person that we're going on a date with by our neighbor or our cousin or our flatmate is so much lower than if we met that person online. And so I think what I would advise somebody is probably different compared to how they met that person. I have noticed that there are people on social media who, like, their whole kind of comedic remit is how to respond to people who ghost you online, because it's such a massive problem now. But I've taken a stand on this, Angela. Like, I had to take a stand, and my stand is that I'm sorry, I'm in the no camp for online dating. I've decided I'm not a supporter of it.
Interesting. That's one way to kind of not have to deal with the stuff that you have to deal with on online dating, is to not even do that. That's I guess a good way to kind of segue to why people even try to get into relationships, is because for a lot of people the trigger is that they're feeling lonely. And so how important are relationships to our well-being, and how do you manage the fact that if you are feeling lonely, what can you do? And this obviously, in the context of loneliness, could also apply for people who are in long-term relationships. You can feel lonely even when you have a partner.
Yeah, I think one of the worst experiences that we can have is like being in a relationship where we feel lonely, right? Like, that's exponentially worse than being lonely when you're out of a relationship. I think all the research shows that the biggest predictor of somebody's mental health or mental well-being is the health of their relationships, right? And so what makes me really sad is that lots of people come to me and they're single and they're really embarrassed to admit that they want to be in a relationship. Like, they're so embarrassed that they don't want to be single. But we're not built to be single. We're absolutely not. The only people who do better when they're single are people who they're extraordinarily independent and relationships aren't really a priority for them. And they do well in life. Like, they'll choose careers, or they'll choose like a kind of a nomadic lifestyle where they might build intimate connections, but those connections those connections don't become that person's community, and they do really well. Other people who don't tend to do well with romantic relationships are people who have had such significant trauma that forging or forming that intimate attachment relationship is just far too triggering and distressing for them. They can't tolerate that kind of closeness. But for most of us, like, we have a primal drive to be in an intimate relationship because we have a primal drive towards dyads, because it replicates that infant attachment stuff. I don't mind that whether somebody's single or in a relationship. I don't think that's what's important. I think all that's important is that people have intimate relationships. And when I say intimate, I mean spiritually, emotionally intimate. And so one of the things I really worry about is that most men my age don't have male friends who they have a intimate relationship with. For example, I asked a guy the other day, like who can you have a deep connection with or a deep conversation with? And he was like, oh, well, the other night I went and got really drunk with somebody, and we're up till 3 a.m. And I was like, well, that's not what I asked. Right. And so ultimately, all that matters is that we have strong attachments with good people who we can have a deep relationship with. It doesn't matter that that person is not a romantic connection. All that matters is like friendship. Friendship is probably the most important relationship that we ever have in our lifetime. So it's relationships which bring us into health, even if they're not romantic ones.
And often we see as a common pattern when someone gets into a romantic relationship, they forsake all their friendship, and then the romantic relationship doesn't go well and they feel too embarrassed to reach back out to their friends who they've kind of neglected for months or years. So yeah, I think it sounds like what you're advocating for is to have as many meaningful relationships with, whether they're romantic or otherwise, in your life, as a good predictor of positive health and well-being. And,
yes, exactly.
And would you kind of, in your opinion, say that there is a difference between sort of being lonely versus being alone? And how would you kind of differentiate that?
I think I would say that maybe alone is by choice, whereas lonely is like not by choice.
And so for someone who's feeling lonely, what you're really saying is like, take the time to reach out to someone, and it can be as simple as you said, just going to a running club and you see the same person every Wednesday, and then take the time to go from every Wednesday to let's grab coffee and talk about things that may or may not be interesting to the other person, and then find something to build a foundation on. Is that what I'm hearing from you? If I'm feeling lonely and I need to address that loneliness?
Kind of like, I think that there are going to be different reasons for somebody's experience of loneliness. So for example, say I have a person who they're like, okay, well, I feel lonely, so I'm going to go and join some groups. And they do that, and then after 6 months, they notice that they're still feeling lonely. What we would probably assume at that point is that that person has forged some superficial connections, but none of them have gone deep. And it's that depth that makes people feel whole. and it's what removes the feeling of loneliness. I think there's many poets and philosophers who at various stages have said that maybe the epitome of loneliness is being surrounded by people and still feeling profoundly alone, right? And so we feel lonely when we feel like we can't share, or that if we did share, we would be judged or rejected or exposed, or we can't share because there's no one who would potentially understand what we're up against, whether that's a self-inflicted or self-imposed belief or not.
I guess that's a good way to kind of ask the question of, therefore, does your own insecurities or your own level of self-esteem affect your ability to build these deeper relationships?
In my experience, it's not about self-esteem. It's more about fear of judgment or fear of not being understood. I think it's a lot easier for women. Like, women overall don't experience the same loneliness that men do. Because within, if you're female, or somebody who identifies as being female, then there are so many different ways to share as women. Like, women share, that's what we do. Like, that's what makes us women, right? But men don't share, and then because men don't share, you see, because there's a culture of not sharing, and so it's very difficult to get men to start to share and open up because men don't share and open up. Whereas if you've got a woman who struggles to open up, at least the culture of womanhood is based around sharing.
So is your advice, therefore, even if you fear that you would be rejected or you fear that people won't understand you, to just do it anyway because it might just be in your head? Is that what you're saying? Or how would you advise people who are not sharing because they have these fears?
The opposite of loneliness is feeling deeply connected or deeply embedded in relationship to the other. And in order to deepen a relationship to another person, we need to take a risk of being vulnerable. And so I guess I would be saying to somebody, dip your toe in the water and share something that's not too vulnerable, but it's like a little bit vulnerable, and see how that person reacts. And if you don't get the response that you needed, then you don't share, you don't start to open up with that person anymore. But what if you did share? What if you did dip your toe in and you got an attuned response? Then how good would that feel? And that may be an impetus to start to share a little bit more. So small risks, I think.
So not just tell your whole life story, but actually just start with something that is a little bit vulnerable and you test the waters. And if you get the type of response you're expecting, then share a little bit more and share a little bit more. Like that, what you were saying before with the spiders, not just go straight into putting the tarantula on someone's hand, but start with the enemy 5 meters back and come from there.
Exactly.
I love to change tack a little bit again, and now talk about it in the context of, let's just say you manage to find someone and you are in relationships, and this can be also like friendships or work relationships. And the predominant thing that stresses most people is conflict. How do you, what are the lessons you've learned and taught around conflict management, regardless of the relationship type?
Great question. A couple of things. These are the things people have conflict about. They have conflict about stuff. For example, they might come to see me because they keep fighting about his in-laws, or they keep fighting about money, or they keep fighting about parenting, right? Those are things. Sometimes people come and they see me and they fight about the relationship. Like, you don't spend enough time with me. I feel deprioritized. You never compliment me anymore. I don't feel desired by you. And then the third type of scenario I see is people come to therapy because they're having conflict about the conflict. So there's no particular theme. It's just that when they have conflict, it always goes the same way. For example, like they bicker about it, and then they throw their hands up in the air and walk out of the room, and that's it. Like the conversation doesn't get picked up again, and so nothing gets resolved. Or maybe you have somebody who's like quite happy to have an argument, and the other person who is super conflict avoidant and just withdraws in the face of a challenge, right? So sometimes it's about fixing the issues, like, let's just finish this conversation or this problem with money once and for all. And then I don't see those people again because they don't actually have an issue with conflict. They just had an issue about finances. But if people are coming because they are having conflict around conflict, the things that I teach them are around human fears. So humans have two fears. We fear either being abandoned or we fear being engulfed. And sometimes we can fear both. And so in every relationship, I swear to God, in every relationship, there's somebody who fears being abandoned, and there's somebody who fears being engulfed or being overpowered or controlled, right? And so the person who fears being abandoned, they're the person who's like, you said we'd talk about it. Can we please talk about it? And the other person who fears being controlled, they shut down and they go very quiet. And so when I give people this, they're like, oh, now I see why my partner keeps trying to chase me. They feel anxious. And then the other person's like, oh, I see why my partner gets overwhelmed by me approaching all the time because they need space. So conflict happens as soon as those kind of primal fears get activated, right? And so it's about helping people be able to get space and conflict that feels safe for both people, which is coming back to the thing I said earlier about how, so for example, if you're in the middle of conflict and you're somebody who doesn't like feeling controlled or suffocated or put on the spot, you can say to your partner, I'm so glad you told me. This is really important. Give me a moment. I need a process, but I will come back to you later and we will talk about it. Immediately, the person who feels anxious feels relieved because they've been heard and they know that their partner's going to come back. If you stay in that scenario where the person who needs space has to stay in that moment, the conflict escalates because the person who's gone quiet is actually sitting there and becoming more and more dysregulated in that moment.
And obviously, when you watch movies or you watch TV shows, what you see is the two angry people shouting and screaming at each other and throwing things at each other. Does that mean that this is two different types of people, not the avoidant person is not in the picture? Or like, how do you process, or like, what if you are in those situations where, whenever you fight, it escalates to that level of intensity? Like, how do you not get into those type of fights, and how do you get yourself out of it when that happens?
I think it's funny because that's actually the main reason I became a couples therapist, is because I was like, I thought that I would see that. Like, I was like, that would be fun to see that, like, just like the movies, but it never happens. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
So you see more of that, like someone coming and the other person pulling away, as the more fighting type of dynamic is what you're saying.
I think the people who do have those movie types of fights, I don't think they come to therapy. Because to have a fight like that, you need to have a secure attachment, because you need to feel safe in being in a fight with that person, right? It means that both people don't feel intimidated by the other person. But in most relationships, there's always one person who conflict makes somebody feel shut down. And sometimes, like, you might have like one of those movie fights, maybe, but invariably there's always somebody who goes, screw this, I'm done. And they walk out. There's always somebody who walks out even after the big movie type fight.
Interesting. And I guess in the context that what we see in our data is most people are avoidant, especially conflict avoidant. But sometimes these conversations, maybe the way that it's being approached is not healthy or helpful, but the actual topic that is being discussed is actually really important to discuss because maybe it really impacts the person's well-being or impacts their decision making. How do you help individuals who tend to be conflict avoidant, who aren't expressing their needs and rather just go along, but then develop, sort of resentment? How do you advise those people to fight better or to advocate for their needs in a way that's actually healthy in the long term?
Great question. One thing I do is I call them sages, and they're like little meetings that a couple can have like once a week or once a fortnight, where the person who is conflict avoidant, I mean, both people can do it, but I try and get the person who's conflict avoidant to raise a little issue that's bugging them, and for their partner to respond graciously so that the person who's avoidant gets a chance to practice what it's like to raise an issue and to see that it can go well. So it's like the tarantula thing again. It's building up tolerance to raising things that are tricky.
Right. So you're saying that people avoid having those difficult or important conversations because they assume it will just go badly anyway. So why even go through the process? I got you.
Exactly.
So you want to make sure that people like that are able to, in small stakes, learn that you can raise issues. Those issues can be addressed without it being some sort of dramatic thing, and then slowly escalate the vulnerability both parties can feel in sharing harder or more deeper conversations.
That's one thing. It's also about picking your timing. So like I give people a handout about when you should raise issues and when you shouldn't. Right? Like, for example, raising issues at bedtime is always going to end up in disaster. Okay? Raising issues in the car. But also, when our partner raises an issue, I think for most of us, and that's myself included, we get defensive. And we get defensive because ultimately this is our human. And we want to impress our human. We want our human to be proud of us. We want to do the right thing by our human. Like most of the time, most of us are trying really hard to be a good partner. And so if our partner is like, you did this wrong, immediately we're like, oh my God, I'm the worst person in the world. And so we go into fight mode. And so even though our partner was just like, could you please leave the butter out before you leave in the morning, we hear that as, you are worthless, you're whatever. And so we meet their complaint or their need with defensiveness because we're so scared of doing it wrong or getting it wrong by them because they're our person. So sometimes it is about coaching the receiving party to be able to hear the request without getting defensive.
What is one practical thing that you coach the person on? Because I also put my hands up to getting defensive.
Assuming that the person who's raised the complaint has done it perfectly. Then it's about, as hard as it is, staying with the feeling that the person is feeling rather than listening to the words. I say that because if you stay with the feeling, you can't drive, or compulsion to get defensive is going to come down a little if you listen to if you start to pay attention to the feelings that your partner might be feeling rather than the words they're saying.
That
Does that
makes
make
sense.
sense?
So I guess like in the context of like what you just said, can you please leave the butter out before you leave for work? What's the feeling I'm listening out for here,
Yeah, probably a feeling of wanting to get stuff done quickly because they're in a rush and they need you to leave the butter out, so they have to go to the fridge. Like, I mean, it's such a inane example to pull out, but like we can get defensive about anything,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I could actually see someone getting defensive about this. So that's how it's like, how do you listen to the feeling when something's so inane as well? But that makes sense. I guess like let's maybe, we've all talked about it in the context of we're two human beings that actually genuinely want to be in healthy relationships. We are not perfect, so we all need to do the self-work. But inevitably, there are people who get into relationships with people who are not good people. They are maybe narcissistic. There might be violence, whether that's physical or emotional abuse. How do you kind of advise people who might be in relationships like that? And how do you know when I'm like, I should just be listening and hearing the feelings versus like, no, this person is totally abusing me, for example?
So I trained with this guy called Perel in the States, and like he taught me relationship therapy, and he says that one of the biggest problems with modern day psychology or modern day therapy is that it's very good at helping people come up from a one down position. What that means is psychotherapy has a history of helping people start to feel better about themselves if they've got low self-esteem. What therapy is not good at is challenging people who are grandiose, who are entitled, who are abusive. It's not good at that. And so you have like a industry of practitioners who are reticent or don't feel trained or confident enough to tell truth to power. And so those are the therapists who might just listen and nod and kind of validate somebody's experience without saying, there's some things you've told me today that make me worried about your psychological safety. And I'm wondering if we could kind of explore that a bit more and potentially like triage you or do a bit of an assessment just to make sure that your relationship is safe, right? If somebody tells me, I'm so efficient at doing these assessments now, but if somebody tells me that they're in an emotionally abusive relationship or any kind of abusive relationship, one, I can tell whether somebody is, but two, I'll just tell them.
Yeah, and it's so helpful. I mean, often even you have friends and families who love you and see it happening and they don't feel it's their place to share. So it is always hard because you don't know how the person's going to react, but just someone saying it, even if they're in denial mode, it plants the seed for them the next time. They might reject your comment at the time, but the next time might be when they might think back about that moment that you shared with them. You talked about how you get very, very efficient around assessing if someone's in an abusive relationship. Is it questions that you're asking? Is it signs you're looking out for? What is it?
Yeah, so when couples want to see me, they have to fill out an application form. And in that application form, I screen for emotional violence. I screen for narcissistic abuse. I screen for sexual violence. I screen for personality disturbance, drug and alcohol, like effectively everything. It's pretty good. I've had some people slip through, but it's pretty robust. And so there is that assessment process beforehand, before people can book in. If they're not a couple, then and I'm just working with an individual and they don't have to fill out an application form, then I am using my own like assessment, a questionnaire sheet when I'm with that person and running them through my red flag screening process. Yeah.
So what happens with those couples that, for example, so are you saying that they are honest about the fact that they're doing these things, and you're reading it and you're like, okay, there we go. This person just said that they commit emotional abuse, for example. Is that what the thought process for you? And then what do you do with those couples?
Yeah. It's extremely rare for me to have an application where physical violence is involved. And I will say this, and it's difficult to say this, but the only applications I've personally had where there's physical violence has been from women towards men. I've not had an application where there's male towards female violence. 95% of the applications where there is violence, it's psychological violence. And what we know from the research is that psychological violence is like way worse than physical violence. But I think it's like 77% of abusive relationships are psychologically violent. Like physical violence is not that common.
What's an example of a psychological violence?
Yeah. Would be things like manipulation's a big one. Making someone feel like you can't live without them. So the person then kind of gets trapped because I often will see men who feel deeply protective of their partner, and the partner makes them feel like if they leave, then they're going to hurt themselves, or they're not going to be able to do life. They'll just fall apart, right? And so if you've got somebody who's very empathic and kind and sensitive and caring, the idea of another human being falling apart is horrible. Like, none of us want to think about that. And so they stay in these relationships where it's very, very manipulative.
And so I guess, what are the signs that, you advise someone to look out for to make them realize that they should probably leave this relationship, especially, as you said, the ones that come to you on a one-to-one basis?
Lying is often a feature. Manipulation, gaslighting, volatility, like being volatile. One of the big ones is actually withdrawal of sex. So people who are abusive, they either want sex all the time or they don't want sex at all. But most of the scenarios cases I've worked where there is abuse, the abuser does not want to have sex with their partner. Very common. So that's a red flag. Another red flag would be that person's previous relationship history. Like often people who use abuse, they don't have a history of secure attachments.
Yeah. Interesting. And, we've gone through a whirlwind of questions, Serafin. Is there anything else you feel you really wanted to share with our audience about things that you've learned and seen in your time as a therapist?
Well, what I can say is that I think what's wonderful about your questions is that they've shown the relationship between relationships and mental health. Your questions have shown that when our relationships aren't going well, it can affect our mental health. And when they are going well, we can feel incredible.
And so if you're not feeling incredible, it's probably a sign for you to either get some extra help, and, Clearhead is an EAP provider. So if your employer uses this, you can get free therapy with awesome relationship experts like Serafin. And if, and at the very least reflect on, whether you're in a relationship that adds to your life or takes away from it. And as Serafin has shared, there are very simple things that you can do, like being better at listening to your partner's needs or like your child's needs, and not being defensive, and being open to not feeling too vulnerable, not having all those fears drive whether you say something or don't say something, or try something or don't try something. So really awesome, Serafin, for you to kind of run us through some very practical ways of managing relationships in our lives. And we always end these conversations with one question, which is like, what is your one practice that you do to stay well?
Oh, wow. I'm only allowed to pick one.
Yes, just one. Or you can list them all. We're also happy to hear what those are.
I'm trying to think of just one. Probably, I love my friends. Like my friends, I really love my friends, and they are funny, smart, kind people, and I love them to bits.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.